Hi, welcome to another IELTS writing video. In this video, we are looking at adjectives, nouns, verbs, and adverbs that you can apply to your writing right now and instantly improve the quality and tone of your academic task 1 message. If you find this video helpful, please come and join me and other IELTS test takers at IELTSnetwork.com and visit my website EnglishRyan.com. I've organized the adjectives, nouns, verbs, and adverbs into this simple table. And here we see one column for adjectives, one column for nouns. Now the adjectives and nouns work as a team, so you can couple them in different ways to properly express what you see in your data source. So I think what we'll do first is we'll go through each of the words and just quickly define what they mean. And I will use my sample graphs here to help explain. Okay, so the first word in our list is abrupt, and I've coupled that with sudden because these two words have very similar meanings. Abrupt and sudden are used to describe a change in a trend that is perhaps somewhat surprising, or it is a change that doesn't follow the pattern that's seen in the rest of the trend. So if we look at this simple graph, we have a period of minor instability, but overall it means somewhat of a plateau, and then we experience an abrupt change. So this trend here, this portion of the trend is completely different from this side. So we would describe this as a sudden climb or an abrupt jump, perhaps. So so that's how we use these two words. Now the next group of words, sharp, steep, rapid, major, dramatic, and marked, are all used to describe a movement either upwards or downwards that is significant. So this would be a change that that it is more major than just a basic change in value. So for example, here we could not describe this as a dramatic jump or a dramatic fall because it's too insignificant. Things aren't changing that much here. It's when we get to this portion when we could say a sharp climb or a dramatic increase or a marked jump, for example. Okay, so that's what these groups of words do. The next two are also describing a change that is notable, but perhaps not as major as these up here. So significant or considerable, these would be things that would describe a portion of the trend that changes, but it's not to a huge or extremely surprising amount. Now next I've grouped steady and gradual. So here we would be describing a trend that is very consistent, so it's perhaps growing at the same pace or declining at the same pace. And modest, gentle, just have to get back here for a second. And I hope that, okay. Modest, gentle, slight, minor, and mild would be to describe something that is perhaps not a very large change. So here in my bar graph, we see a modest change between 1940 and 1950. Okay, here's another modest change. It's not huge. I mean, it's obviously not as big as this would be between 1910 and 1920. So we would describe it perhaps more as modest, gentle, or slight. Slight would be more, say, between 1960 and 1970. Okay, so that is my list of adjectives. Now, you can couple these adjectives with the nouns that you see on the right side. And let's go through the meaning of each of these nouns. For the first, we have a peak. Now, a peak marks a point in the trend that is the highest or the largest value. And typically a peak would happen sometime in the middle of the graph. So for example, if I take this here, we could describe this as a peak. It's just that we don't have data for 1980, so it's sort of, you know, it's, well, to me anyways, it just feels like it would be a little bit improper to describe this as a peak simply because it's the end of the graph, and then we don't know what happens next. But if this point were to happen, say, somewhere in the middle, like that, and come down again, then this would be a very accurate use of peak. Okay, so we could say that the graph, usually we use peak with, say, a verb like hits a peak in 1940. Okay, a surge. Now, a surge is a growth that is sudden and unexpected. And I've put surge by itself in this list because surge has direction, and it also has qualifying to it. So when you describe surge, you couldn't describe it as, for example, a gentle surge, because surge is already, you know, a word that we would use to describe a strong increase. Okay, so and you wouldn't use a sharp surge either, again, because surge already contains some qualifying elements in it. Now, an increase, a growth, a rise. These are words that we could couple with our adjectives on this side. So, for example, we could describe this portion of the graph at the end here as a sharp increase. We could describe it as a dramatic growth. We could describe it as a marked rise, perhaps a little bit more than a marked rise, though, maybe a steep rise. Okay, or we could describe it as a surge. Now let's continue on here. We have three more words: a variation, a volatile period, a fluctuation. And these are three nouns we would use to describe a period of time that maybe the values go up and go down and go up and go down. So here, obviously, we might describe this period here as minor fluctuation. There's not a lot of, I mean, if it was going up and down, we might say that's, you know, true fluctuation in the graph. But this is more, you know, minor or perhaps even gentle or modest fluctuation. Okay. A plateau, a period of stability or a period of instability. So a plateau would be, this graph has a fairly accurate picture of a plateau. A plateau is a period when things don't change. So between 1920 and 1940, this is a plateau. And a period of stability is less rigid. A plateau, if you're going to describe something as a plateau, it really should be more or less exactly the same. But a period of stability, we could describe perhaps this area of our graph here as a period of stability because the values are more or less the same. Okay? A period of instability would be when things are kind of, you know, fluctuating wildly, so going up and going down. That would be instability. Okay, and then we have a decrease, a decline, a dip. So these are words that are obviously just describing a downward trend, and we would likely use adjectives to qualify these words. So we could talk about a sharp decrease. Okay, so for example, in this graph, we see a sharp decrease between 1910 and 1920. We could say a steep decline, a dramatic decline, a considerable dip. Okay, these would be all fitting ways to describe something that is quite dramatic, a downwards movement that's quite dramatic. Now at the bottom of my table here, I have a fall, a nosedive, and a drop. And obviously these three words would be accurate ways to describe this portion of our graph. Now nosedive and drop, actually more particularly nosedive, I probably should have put nosedive at the bottom of my list here, but so nosedive would be something like this. It's a very, very large fall. between 1950 and 1960, this is not a nosedive, but we could describe it as, say, a modest drop, for example. So we had a modest drop between 1950 and 1960, or between 1940 and 1970, we had a gradual decline. Okay, so this decline here, it's sort of moving at more or less equal increments, and we could describe the whole thing as a gradual or a steady fall. Okay, now let's move on to our verbs and adverbs. So on the verb side, we have to peak, which is the word that you saw before, and as you probably can guess, this is when we're going to describe a point when the trend perhaps jumps to the highest point, or it doesn't even need to jump, though it could just move up to the highest point and then it starts to move down. So the highest point in that trend, we would say it peaks. To skyrocket, so let me pull out my graph here again. So we could say that sales skyrocketed between 1960 and 1970. Jump, sales jumped between 1960 and 1970. And to surge, to increase, to rise, to grow, to move. Now I want to spend a second to talk about move. Now if you look at increase, rise, and grow, these are all words that describe a positive movement or a movement that is upwards. A move, it doesn't describe any direction. So we have to be sure that if we're going to use move, that we're qualifying where exactly the figures are moving to. Is this a positive move, a negative move? Is it a sharp upwards move? Vary, fluctuate, destabilize. So again, these three words would be talking about a trend that's moving into a period where the figures go up and go down and go up and go down. And so here again, we could use that, but we'd have to make it clear that this is very mild. This is not major fluctuation. Decrease, decline, dip, slip, and fall. All verbs to describe downwards movement. Okay. So, and these downwards movements would likely need to be qualified as well. So we would want to couple them with an adverb to more clearly describe what's going on in the data source. And then we get down to the bottom here: to plunge, to dive, to nosedive, to plummet, to drop. And these are all verbs that have a certain qualifying element to them, and they would be accurate in describing, for example, 1910 to 1920. So sales figures between 1910 and 1920 plummeted. That would be an accurate way to describe this portion of the graph. Or sales in 1910 were 300 million Australian dollars, and this figure plunged to 98 million Australian dollars in 1920. Okay, now let's look at the adverbs and then talk about ways that we can couple the verbs and adverbs together. So we have positively and not sure I got this out of order here. Okay, positively here. I have positively already in my list. Positively and negatively. Okay, and these would be positively usually is to describe an upward movement, negatively to describe a downward movement. Abruptly and suddenly, as we described before, so we could say the figure jumps abruptly. That would be an accurate way to describe this portion of the graph. The figure jumps abruptly. We could say the trend, or we could say in 1960, sales suddenly surged. Okay. Now, let's continue here. Sharply, steeply, rapidly, dramatically, markedly. Okay, so, and now let's see here. Our fall from above here, from 1910 to 1920, we could say that the figures declined dramatically during this decade. Significantly, considerably. words that we've defined before. So these are they're large changes, they're important changes, but they're perhaps not extremely surprising, or not like what we were describing is going on here. Steadily, gradually. Okay, so the sales experienced negative growth, and we could say that between 1940 and 1970, sales declined steadily. Modestly, gently, slightly, mildly. And so these words probably would want to reserve them for describing, say, differences between a 1960 and 1970 figure. So the figures fell slightly. Okay, often gently is a good word to describe figures that sort of a couple of maybe 2, 3, 4 different figures that are moving in the same direction. You could say, oh, there was a gentle decline, which it's sort of a round way of saying that it wasn't completely stable, but there was a more or less stable direction in the trend seen. Okay, so I hope those lists introduced a few new words to you. Now I wanted to take a second and show you how we can put these words into action. Okay, so now let's start by describing our chart that shows sudden upward movement in 1960. So we could start by describing this period in here, 1910 to 1960, like this. So perhaps, oops. So following some minor instability, okay, because as we mentioned before, this period is unstable, but it's not major in any way. It's just kind of a minor up and down. So following some minor instability between 1910 and 1960, sales, and we can even stick in here for company XYZ if we wanted to. Actually, just excuse me one second. I'm going to get all this onto one side. I'm sorry. I should have prepared better for this, but okay. Okay, so following some minor instability between 1910 and 1960, sales for company XYZ surged, let's say, from just over 100 million Australian dollars. Oh, we're sticking a million there. Australian dollars to 246 million Australian dollars. Okay. Now, if we look at this, so what we've done is we've included an adjective and a noun, and we've included a verb, and as I mentioned before, surged already has quite a bit of meaning behind it, so we don't really need to qualify it further. Okay, now we could easily change these words and keep the meaning the same. So let's try something like after fluctuating, and now I need an adverb. What would be a good adverb to describe this? Maybe mildly, after fluctuating mildly between 1910 and 1960, sales, and then again I could type sales of company XYZ. Sales experienced dramatic growth, let's say. Okay, adjective, noun, dramatic growth from 100 million Australian dollars to 246 million Australian dollars. Okay. So you can see I'm just taking words from our lexical resource here and I'm just coupling them in different ways. Okay, now let's try describing the other graph here, the one that shows negative movement in the sales numbers of company XYZ. So So we're going to start with, now let me get this one showing up here. Okay. So in 1910, sales, okay, so what would be a fitting word here? We could say they dropped, they fell, they decreased. So sales fell sharply. Okay, I'm using my adjective to frame this, or I could change this to sales fell dramatically. Okay, sales fell dramatically from 300 million Australian dollars to, now what I like to do here is when we have a period that looks like this, instead of going, 1920 it was $98 million, 1930 it was also $98 million. Let's just group all of this together. Okay, we'll just call it a plateau, let's say. So we could say, so in 1910 sales fell dramatically from 300 million Australian dollars to a 3-year plateau of $98 million. I'm sorry, 98 million AUD, Australian dollars. Okay, so now we've described from 1910 to 1940. Now this whole graph is a little bit difficult to do in a single sentence because we do have so much change going on. You see, we have this major fall, then a period of stability, and then it's sort of a gradual decline to 1970. So we could cram it all into one sentence, but it might seem a little bit too condensed, too full. So let's continue. Sales then. So what's happening here? We could say they dipped. They dipped. Or we could qualify the word dropped. Drop is usually for perhaps a bit more of major fall, but we could use dropped here. So sales then, let's use dipped. Sales then dipped, and this dip it's not major. So let's use modestly. They dipped modestly to 70 million. In 1950, and now 1960 and 1970 again are showing very similar amounts. So we could say that the value is sort of around 50 million. So we could use perhaps a word like hovering. I should have included that in my list, but so before hovering around $50 million. 50 million AUD in 1960 and 1970. Okay, so let's read the whole thing. In 1910, sales fell dramatically from 300 million Australian dollars to a 3-year plateau of 98 million Australian dollars. Sales then dipped modestly to 70 million. Oh, again, I forgot my unit. Australian dollars in 1950 before hovering around 50 million Australian dollars in 1960 and 1970. Now we could try a different way to explain what's going on here. So perhaps something like in 1910, let's use our word plummeted, because I have a feeling that might be a new word for some people. Sales plummeted from 300 million AUD. And again, so plummeted is sort of like surged in that it has so much meaning behind it, you don't really need to qualify it further. If I were to say sales majorly plummeted, it just sounds kind of awkward because plummeted already has, the major meaning behind it. Okay, 300 million Australian dollars to a 3-year period. Let's call it this time a period of stability. We called it a plateau last time. Period of stability at 98 million Australian dollars. Okay, and then let's try grouping these remaining figures together. So for example, I mean, in this graph it's quite simple, so we could take the time to explain each figure by itself, but sometimes in the IELTS you'll get, you know, several figures that you need to describe accurately, and you can't hit every single little minute detail without sounding sort of like you're going over the top to overly, you know, hit every little point. So we can sort of group this trend into one, and we could write something like sales then dropped gradually over the next 3 years to 70, I think it's about 70, yeah, million, maybe it's about 80 actually. Sorry, I just want to get this accurate. 80 million Australian dollars, 51 million Australian dollars, and 49 million Australian dollars, respectively. Now, whoops. Okay, now one thing that I'll point out here is we have these three figures sort of grouped together and we're listing them one after the other. What you can do is you can remove the units. So see, they're all million Australian dollars. So it sort of sounds robotic and repetitive when we go 80 million Australian dollars, 51 million Australian dollars, and 49 million Australian dollars when we're listing them like this. So I can just take out the unit, okay? So I have 80, 51, and 49 million Australian dollars respectively. And I just retain the unit on the last figure here. Okay, and it makes it read a little bit more fluently. Okay, so that's the conclusion of the video. I hope that helped to explain how you can couple these words to better describe what you see in your data sources. I will put a full list of these words at IELTSnetwork.com if you want to go check it out, and you can download it and play around with the words there. I'll also put it up at my blog. Thank you very much for watching, and have a nice evening.